Good evening to all. I am Dr. Pilar Regalado, and I would like to thank ESHRE for giving us the luxury of presenting our study here today at their annual meeting. We're going to talk about identity, anonymity, and gamete donation. This is a very controversial issue around the world in science, between professionals. Reproductive medicine and technologies with gamete donation has completely shifted humanity's perspective on what human reproduction is at its core, and it's given a new form of coming into being. So it is our duty as professionals not only to benefit from these techniques, but also to try to prevent any type of harm that the use of these techniques could have in all of the involved. When we talk about identity, we're mainly talking about, in this context, what the characteristics, the consensus characteristics that make an individual different from the rest, and different and identifiable. So in that sense, anonymity would be withholding this information to an extent that you wouldn't be able to identify it. In this sense, when we talk about revelation of origins, which we're going to see, we find in many research studies, in many lectures or texts, there's two important aspects and they're different, and it is important not to confuse them. So one aspect is when we're talking about revealing the origins of how one was born. So in this sense, we're going to find that there's a general consensus that parents who have used techniques with gamete donation should, or it's positive, to tell their offspring that they were born this way. Not necessarily that they have to tell them who the donor was, but that they were born this way. And then on another aspect, we're going to see that the revelation of origins is talking about having access to one's biological or genetical origin. And this would include everything that it involves, not only how they were born, but if there was gamete donation, to make it possible to know who the donor was. Let's see a little review of a brief history of what has happened around the world regarding this and how it is today. So it's been a little bit over 4 decades since this has been possible. Initially it was sperm donation and then egg donation, maybe a decade or a couple of decades later. And it was in Europe and also in North America that the first legislations that came about, actually the first one was Sweden as a pioneer in terms of prohibiting anonymity, but every other country was going about these treatments setting as a default anonymity for the donor. And today that has been changing progressively, and many countries now, there's no more than 20 countries around the world with legislation around this, but there's many countries that started off with anonymity that have shifted and made it possible for having identificatory information about the donors. So we're seeing a tendency of switching in this sense, although there's still many countries in Europe that are staying with anonymity. And they have their reasons, and we're gonna dive into them just in a bit. And well, there's also today some countries that actually have both, that it would be up to the parents to decide if they're going to use a donor that would allow to have access to revealing the identity. What we want to highlight today is what's going on in Latin America, because there's 15 countries in Latin America that practice reproductive assisted treatments, and the majority of them don't have any legal framework. They're actually going about practicing art without having any legal guidelines on how to do it. But what is set and what is practiced as well is anonymity in donors. And this is the case in every country. There's only, out of 15, there's only 4 countries that do have some sort of either law or some regulations that are going to talk about how gamete donation should be. And only one country, which is Argentina, where we made this study, contemplates in the civil code, in the laws, that anonymity should be the case for donation and gamete donation, but that there's an exception for the offspring. If they want to know the identity of the donor, they could possibly know, but they would have to go about it asking for it with a judicial process. REPROBANK at our clinic, we've been working for around 10 years, and there we saw a lot of social need, a lot of patients' needs, wanting to have the possibility of making their treatment with a donor that has an identity release program. So we went ahead and we tried to take bits and pieces out of different countries of how they do it. And we made a program which is called PIA. In Spanish, it would mean donors, a program with identity release in donors. And we've been offering this for over 5 years, almost 6, initially with sperm and then with eggs. But we're the only bank in Latin America that offers in gamete donation both anonymous donors and identity release donors. So this program is what it does is having donors which they want to be able to give their identity to the offspring when they're 18, and if they want to, only to them. We have made a study about all these years what we have encountered, and our sample constitutes a sample of donors of 237 donors on the one hand, because we have patients on the other. Sperm donors, we found that 44% of them chose an open identity program. So that's nearly half of them. And when we're talking about egg donors, it's more than half. So it was surprising, and it was very reassuring as well. When we go to patients, we've asked the question, who chooses the identity program? And well, we found that a third of our patients, when it's sperm donation, only sperm donation, a third of patients want an open identity program. So it might be a minority, but this is a lot. And when we try to see if there's any differences in terms of the family type, well, we found this to be so, and such as in other studies we've seen. In our case, it's 1 out of 10 heterosexual couples that actually wanted an open identity donor, 3 out of 10 women couples, and when it comes to single women, it's half of them. When we see egg donation, it's a bit different. We didn't find statistically significant differences, but still half of heterosexual couples when it comes to egg and sperm donation. And it's going to be a third in single women and a third in 2 women couples. What are we going to find in research in general? There's going to be 2 completely opposite views. One of the views is sustaining that anonymity should be the way of donation, and the main arguments that we see is that we should protect patients' rights for confidentiality, for privacy, that if a patient doesn't want to tell their children or the world that they used gamete donation, that we should protect that. They also talk about donors' rights, that donors have the right to remain anonymous and their confidentiality. They are going to talk about as well of the possible interference that a donor could have in the family if the identity is revealed. And also, a main concern is that the donor supply is going to decrease dramatically. This has happened in other countries, but it has had a comeback. And in what we can see in this study is that, well, it's half of the donors that are willing to, that actually chose to donate it with an identity release program. So it could decrease, but not to the extent of not making treatments possible. They also would say that it's a very low percentage of children who later on want to know the identity of the donor. And even more so, they say that the needs that those children or adults have of knowing the donor or the donor's identity is not going to be solved by knowing their identity. So the main argument that goes around all of these statements is that when deciding to legalize either anonymity or identity release donation, that we should take into account and choose the majority of values or the majority of benefits of those involved. So they say that the majority would be to keep it anonymous if we take into account patients' rights, donors' rights, and all the things that I previously mentioned. On the other hand, when we read about the right to a genetic origin, we're going to be listening about the rights of the child that comes from the Rights of the Child Convention from 1989 that talks about different rights the child has, such as the right to identity. And also another statement is that health professionals and many organizations are positive towards openness, towards revealing. Also regulations and legislations, there's a tendency around the world, as we said, of making this this information accessible to the offspring. And another argument that we align with it too is that even if it's a low percentage of children, even if it's not the majority of patients who want this, it's enough for us to protect those minorities as well. So the main argument is that we should protect the right to access personal, biological, and genetic origins. Just for final conclusions, well, we have seen that there is a general agreement in research and around the world that the individual born has the right to know how they were born. And the disagreement comes when whether knowing the donor's identity is positive or not. And we know that there's a lack of scientific evidence on either side. But should we wait for there to be evidence of harm for trying to prevent it? This is the scientific study of psychological and social effects of treatments with gamete donation. It's still at its infancies, but still there's a lot of health professionals that think it's positive to have this information available. Also, most inclusive and progressive countries are legislating this way. And this study as well shows that it's a different culture, it's Latin America, but we are finding the same things as research has shown us. And there's enough organizations and associations around the world wanting to protect that right, that we cannot ignore them. And we have to take that into consideration. And maybe the final conclusion here is to leave an open question, is why shouldn't we just leave it up to those who are born to decide? Because those people are the only ones that are not being asked what they want, not when we do the treatments. So this is, I hope this enlightens in any way. It's not about rejecting one or perspective or the other, but it's about showing that there's enough need and that there's enough information for us to contemplate, at least to leave the door open and not close it forever for people who might find it that it's essential for them. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, you're going to have my contact. We can further this conversation, and it's been a pleasure. Gracias.